End of the AGM. And I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to bring up Jeff's. So I want to share and Jeff's. Okay. So it gives, any other announcements? The next meeting will be our Christmas slideshow. I think it's Tuesday, the 2nd of December. And we'll have an announcement go out on that. And we do that both online and in person. And the winter program, hopefully we'll have some information in the newsletter when we get it out. But for the January, February, March, you're just going to meet by Zoom. And then by April, we'll come back here in the auditorium. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jeff Franklin. Jeff works as part of the Plant Physiology team at Atlantic Food and Horticultural Research Centre in Kentville, Nova Scotia. Jeff's work includes studying the impact of climate, past and future, on various horticultural crops, with an emphasis on the wine grape. As part of this effort, Jeff has provided analysis of climate data from our region to various commodity groups as both a diagnostic and a predictor of agricultural output in our growing season. So we're very interested to hear from Jeff. Thank you.
So the first thing I should get out of the way is the mic checks. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Just ask online.
If I stand over here, can you still hear me?
Just check online. Can you hear online if you're standing over there? What's happened? You okay there?
I can.
Can you check the
yeah, it sounds good.
And I assume I just hit enter to go forward here.
Or the arrow button. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The arrow. Which one is the arrow? This one.
Okay.
Perfect.
So I want to thank you for inviting me here tonight. So I've been with the federal government since 1998. And I think about 2001, I was approached and said, we have this side project, this thing you want to look at. We have some climate data. Maybe you want to hang on to that, put that on the corner of your desk and answer a few questions for industry. So at that time in 2001, climate wasn't front and center on the minds of growers, of Canadians for the most part. And in that period of time, I think that the climate piece now represents probably 30 to 40% of what I do on a daily basis. And so as I transition to the end of my career, we're looking to pass this on and make this a full-time thing, because I think this will be the fourth presentation I've given this year directly, plus directly reporting to industry. So it's been interesting. It's been fun to develop and share this with you. I come from the perspective of agriculture. I don't have a lot of background in ornamental horticulture, personal interest, but I think I can tell the story either way. So I think it's good to go back when we talk about climate. Let's go back to the beginning. So if we go back 15,000 years ago, the Maritimes were covered in approximately a kilometer of ice. So I took this photo in 1997. I had the privilege to do some research in the high Arctic on Ellesmere Island. That was the last contract that I did before I went to work for the federal government. And it just impressed me. There's this ominous feeling when you stand at the foot of a glacier, and a more ominous feeling today. I just got back from Iceland in June, when you stand at the foot of a glacier and realize that they're all retreating. It does impact one. So if I take that 15,000 years since the end of the last glaciation, the Wisconsin glaciation, and put that in perspective of the geological time of the Earth. Now I'm going to transition over here a little bit and do some pointing. So that 15,000 years on that yellow line, and I actually had to embellish that line quite extensively to even make it show up. The point I want to make is the last 15,000 years, the period that everything we know about the Earth, we've learned in that period of time. Civilization has expanded rapidly, happened right at the bottom of this little piece here. It seems infinitesimally small in relation to the geological time span of the Earth, 4.5 billion years, scientific estimate. 543 million years that there's been detectable life on the surface of the planet. Not talking about the oceans, but on land. And that very tiny yellow line represents, almost everything that we know about human civilization. So if we break that down a little further, so this plot represents, it's just a very rough graph showing the relative temperature changes in that last 15,000 years. And just a couple of points I want to make with this. So agriculture appeared in South America right about 9,000 years ago. Now I know it appeared in other places before then, probably 12 to 50,000 years on other continents. But that's where it first appears in South America. And then we have this, European settlers arrived much, much, much later. But what's interesting is that we've kind of bracketed that period of time that agriculture has been around in the Americas, a relatively stable period of warm temperature. There's not a lot of change in the relative temperatures through the whole Holocene maximum on either side. And so you're wondering, why is he telling me all this? Where is he going with this? And so also just to mention that everything we know about this period of time, most of these are temperature estimates by what we call proxy. So we know from the fossil record, we know from ice cores, we don't know from direct temperature measurement. And this tiny rectangle on the end is what we know from direct measurement. So again, why do I tell you this? Why do I talk about the last 15,000 years? And I think it's important to realize that since agriculture appeared about 9,000 years ago, we've enjoyed a climate amenable to food production. We're still dependent on a favorable climate to continue to produce food. We have not, at any time in research, engineered climate out of food. We need good climate for food. So I'll also admit at this point, my graduate work is in mathematics. So don't run for the door yet. My undergrad work was in biology, and I went on and did graduate work in mathematics. So I get very excited about data. And as I put together this presentation, at some point I hit 60 slides. I thinned it down. But I think we have something, and this is what was given back to me in 2001. We have something very important here. Our Kentville weather record goes back to 1913. So that's a considerable period of time. The Nepean, also a research center, northern Nova Scotia, goes back to 1913 as well. And in Yarmouth, we can go right back to 1870. And so this gives us a great opportunity to look at the changes in climate, to see where things are headed, to see what we've been through and how this relates to agricultural output. And most of the data that's in that long-term weather data set just came from very simple instruments: a minimum maximum thermometer and essentially a bucket to measure the amount of rain that fell on a daily basis. So I would say for that Yarmouth data set, gets close to, well, over 100 years of that data came with a min-max thermometer and a bucket. And only since the 1980s and 1990s have we begun to automate weather stations. So this is just a view of what we call the weather compound in Kentville. I could not tell you what the cost of that is. It's owned by Environment Canada. It's on our site at the Kentville Research Station. So we sort of co-share that data. We collect the same data that they do. They use theirs for meteorology and for climate predictions. We use ours also for climate predictions and to share with industry. And just to show you relatively the three long-term data sets that I'm going to talk about, where they are in the province. Now we are a little bit southern biased here on this data, but that's just the way it is with long-term data sets. It's very hard to find people, and research stations like ours are usually willing to do it, that will commit to having the weather data taken in the exact same place for a very long period of time. I mean, this has been handed off, when you think about it, since 1913, probably to 20 people, and I'm the 20th person that's fought to keep our measurements in that exact same spot. And we need that because if we move those instruments even a short distance away, maybe a couple hundred feet, then it puts a bit of a bend in the data. And it's hard to interpret that bend when we're trying to extract from that the climate trend. So we want this to always be taken in the same spot for as long as we can keep it going. So that's what we've done in Kentville and Nepean, and more or less in Yarmouth. It's moved around a little bit, but not so much that we can't work with that data. So what I have here, each one of those dots on that graph is a single daily observation through 17 years of weather data. I just took a subsection of that data out, 17 years from the Kentville weather data from 1913 on to 1930. And so there's a lot that goes on in that data. And in this case, what I plotted there is just simply daily minimum temperatures. And there's a seasonal component, and then there's a long-term trend, and it's that long-term trend that we're interested in, and that's where the mathematical part comes in. That's where they brought me in, because to extract that trend out of cyclical data is a little bit dicey, and it's difficult to do that well. But I also think it's interesting in this plot, and I'll just show you. So temperatures below -25. I mean, horticulturally speaking, agriculturally speaking, temperatures below -25 put very serious limitations on the perennial crops that you're going to grow. Certainly, I work in wine grape research, and I can assure you there was no wine grape research being done in that period from 1913 to 1929. Because you can see the number of times where we had temperatures below -25, and we would not have had any grape crop at all. So it's not that there weren't grapes in Nova Scotia and that people weren't working with them, but there was no agricultural base in that. So we take that cyclical data and we just extract the trend. And that's what I plotted for you here. This is the trend that we've seen in temperature for Yarmouth. I picked that one first because it's the longest data set that we have. Now there's some interesting features in that. And if I actually predict what I was going to put up there, you probably thought I was going to put some sort of straight line, upward sloping. But of course, it isn't that simple. It's never that simple. We think of anthropogenic climate change, the thing that's being caused by human activity, as being a fairly constant and maybe recently accelerating trend. But there are all kinds of other components that make up our weather data. And again, I'll venture over here. So if we look at this, we see a period in here, in parentheses, of a feature that's called the earliest 20th century warming. It's not very well understood because we weren't doing enough climate research back at that time, but it's believed to be caused by both the very early stages of human-caused climate change and the other, what we call decadal and multi-decadal climate change. It's climate impacts, things like the North Atlantic Oscillation and the El Nino, La Nina, that sort of binary switch that we have there. And so with that, to me, what's interesting about plots like this is that we think of human-caused climate change being the biggest part of the trend, but we have all these other impacts that get added to that. So at any given time, we have not only the impacts of adding more CO2 into the environment, we also have the other natural variability in the climate that goes on as well. And so we see in Yarmouth that we've seen about 1.5 to 2 degrees over 140 years, which is consistent to what we measure for climate change in Canada. If I add the other two sites, Kentville and Nepean, we see the same sort of features. We see early 20th century warming, and we see a shift towards accelerating temperature change since 1960. So I want to talk about the impacts on agriculture. I want to bring this data and connect it to things that we see in terms of the work that I do in agricultural research. And so I'm going to divide the year up into two separate phases. The agricultural winter, which I consider from November to March when things are dormant, and also from April to October, which would be the agricultural summer period or the growing season. So I hope you don't get tired of graphs because there will be a few more as we'll work through here. So this just looks at the average winter temperatures in Kentville. So we took the daily temperature every day from November 1st to the end of March, took one big average. That's what every one of those plots represent. And so there's a trend line through there, and we see a lot of the same features that we've talked about before. We see some accelerating change in temperature in the last, since 1960. We see signs of early 20th century warming. And when you look, they just think, well, there's some advantage here. Don't we all want a warmer winter? Aren't we all hoping for a more pleasant winter? And sure, positive impacts. You know, it costs less to heat our houses. We spend less time shoveling our driveways. All good things. I won't deny. But there are definitely some negative impacts on the perennial crops that we have in place. There's definitely negative impacts on those because of the physiological need for a certain degree of chilling. And when I said, you know, my work with climate data is 30 to 40% of what I do now, that other 60% is to look at those physiological components of crops, specifically, or in the last probably 7 or 8 years on wine grape. So we're all familiar with the concept of climate zones, and we go to the nursery, we pick up a plant, you know, we look at the zone, we say, do I live in that zone? You know, is this plant going to make it? Is it going to flower or not in this area? But we think of that as a constant. We think of, you know, there's a number there, -20 or -25. And in a simplistic way, and I've certainly fallen victim to this myself, you bring that home and then it doesn't quite work out that way. You're never quite sure why. There's a kind of a dependent cycle here. So it's, when we say that wine grape, for instance, if I said that the Marquette grape is good to -37 degrees, that's what it's been tested to in Quebec. That we can get that Marquette grape through a -37 winter. It was developed in Minnesota, so you know, it was developed for cold winters. But it can only do that if it has cold weather leading up to the winter. We need cold weather to induce that maximum level of hardiness. And I talk about this in terms of grape, but I think this is also true. I also see observations in ornamentals as well. The same problem happens. And I'm going to tell you the story through my work, through my physiology work. So today included, and every day or most days through the winter for the last 6 or 7 years, I've done essentially this. You see there's a little group of buds here. I know the people online can't see where I'm pointing, but there's a little group of buds on the right-hand photo. Those are just grape buds. So we go out into the vineyards and we cut a bunch of grape canes and then we excise the buds off, put them in these little trays, put those trays in a freezer. And I did that right before I left to come here tonight. Put those in the freezer, and the freezer runs all night and it freezes them, and it tells us exactly the freezing point of those buds. So it's a beautiful thing that you got. You know, while I stand here, 500 data points are being generated that I'll pick up in the morning, and then I'm going to go out tomorrow and add another 500 to it, and I'm going to keep doing that. And it's a very data-rich thing. And so because of that, we can see these week-to-week changes in the hardiness of a plant, because, as it turns out, grapes and cherries and peaches, they all freeze instantaneously. They don't freeze slowly. They don't have small amounts of damage. A grape bud is good until it hits that freezing point, and then the bud dies. And that those buds that do that are said to be super cool. So they'll freeze all at once in one big shot. And so the strategy of the plant is to make it so that those cells can't freeze, so that bud can't freeze. Things like apple and pear don't do that at all. You can actually have partial cold damage in an apple or pear bud, but a grape or a cherry or a peach bud, they go in one shot. And so when I cut off those grape buds and I stick them in that little tray and I put them in the freezer, that freezing point of that bud is a perfect or very close to the exact estimate of the in situ hardiness of the plant as we see it in the field. So I can just keep doing this all winter long and see how this plays out, see how this changes, as I've been doing for years. So these are plots that we share with industry, with the grape growing industry in Nova Scotia. And there's a lot of information here, so we'll pause here for a minute. I'll explain to you what's going on. You see the points, the dark black line, about halfway up the graph. So those are the minimum observed temperatures in Kentville. And that's important because it only takes 1 hour or half of an hour down at that minimum temperature for us to lose grapes if they go below the hardiness of the grape buds. So we see where that dark line is, so that's literally measuring the day-to-day minimum temperature. The colored lines down below that are the freezing points that we measured in that freezer of 5 different varieties of grape. We've measured them all winter long. I think that one was at 2-week intervals. And so a couple things should be quite apparent when you look at this graph. So I'll ask this to the group that's here. How many people are familiar with varieties such as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Riesling? How many people are familiar with Lacadie Blanc and Seyval Blanc and Marquette? Fewer people, right? Hybrids. So we have the Vitis vinifera varieties and we have the hybrid varieties. And the Vitis vinifera varieties just aren't as hardy as the hybrid varieties. And they can be off by quite a bit. Now this creates a challenge. And this is part of the business model in agriculture, because we all know if we were grape growers, we'd all want to grow the brands, the varieties of grape that have the best consumer appeal. But as it turns out in this case, those European varieties don't have the hardiness in the winter that we would like them to see, because that hardiness for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir is about -23 to -25. And we can definitely get that on some years here in Nova Scotia. If you're willing to walk away from that and go with the hybrid varieties, less consumer appeal, but you get much more hardiness in the plant. And what we provide for growers all winter long is a measurement of that distance between the lowest observed temperatures and the hardiness of those individual varieties, which we call the margin of safety. And sometimes, like in this year, 2018, 2019, there's a huge margin of safety, and it stayed that way all winter long. And some winters, that margin of safety disappears. So to make the point a little clearer, I'm just going to stick with just 2 varieties, and 2 that I've just kind of mentioned. Marquette grape it's a hardy, vigorous red grape. Came out of the Minnesota breeding program. Hardy to -37 in Quebec. Produces a medium body red wine, really nice grape. And but it has a limited consumer profile. We have, on the other hand, and we're all familiar with this one, Chardonnay. That variety goes back probably to the 1500s. So it's not vigorous in Nova Scotia and only hardy to maybe -23 to -25, but a very strong consumer profile. So if I, again, look at the data, so the data in the bottom graph is simply the hardiness of Chardonnay and Marquette, just like on that previous plot. In fact, I extracted those lines from that previous plot. And you can see that hardiness is not a straight line thing. We start off in October with hardiness, in the -15 to -20. We hope that in the middle of winter, we get down to the -25 to -30 range. But we can see with a grape like Marquette, it's sometimes in the middle of winter loses its hardiness. If you look at the top graph, each one of those red-blue bars are just the daily high and low for that same period of time as we measured them in Kentville. And again, there's a lot of data there to look at, but I'll help you out here a bit. So inside that red rectangle, we had a period of warm temperatures. And those warm temperatures didn't have much impact on Chardonnay, but they caused Marquette to lose its hardiness. So for one thing, as you can see from that plot, Marquette is known to be good down to -37. Well, it didn't get anywhere close to -37 in hardiness in that year. And in fact, it came up to about -27 as the weather warmed up that winter. As the weather cooled down again a little bit later, it changed and it went back to its hardiness. But we even though Marquette is known to be good down to -37, you would never get it below -32, any hardier than -32 in Kentville, because we don't have sufficient cold weather to get that hardiness. And so there's a hidden truth there. Whenever we look at hardiness of plants, the maximum hardiness that was achieved for that plant in the area where it was bred may not be what we're going to get in our region when we go to plant that out. So 2023, does anybody remember what stood out with the winter of 2023? Polar vortex. Yeah.
Ruined us tremendously.
Yes. I have a couple of those on my property, and it definitely impacted them. So in 2023, we were doing the same survey as we always did. And I think this plot is quite telling. And it's plots like this that we show our managers when they say, well, why do you do all this? Why do you keep making these plots? Because in this year, the plot worked out perfectly. It was a perfect predictor of what was going to make it through the winter. So the black line again is the observed daily minimum temperatures. On February the 4th, we received a minus 25.5 in Kentville, but that was preceded by unseasonably warm weather. So if you look at the hardiness of Marquette, which, we've talked about it being minus 37, well, it doesn't get that good in Nova Scotia. Some years minus 32, but in the presence of unseasonably warm weather, it only made it to, I think it was minus 27 that year. That was its maximum hardiness. And so we received a minus 25.5 on February 4th. Any of the European varieties, we stopped sampling them at that period of time because we could not find any buds that had not perished. Anything that was hardy below that minus 25.5, we could continue to sample through the winter. They made it through. And that's just how tight that event is. That single event wiped out grape buds for anything that wasn't hardy down to that zone. So that black line that comes down, it always comes down like a knife and cuts off anything that had shallow hardiness. Anything else that was below that made it through. And so it's from that we get our confidence to that we're making a really good, robust estimate of hardiness when we just simply freeze those buds. So just to give you an idea what grape buds look like. So the photo on the left would be of a grape bud still on the cane. They're quite small, only a couple millimeters long. And we've cut that, if you think of the bud going up like this, we've just kind of cut it longitudinally. We've looked down inside. What's interesting about grape buds is that they're compound. They're not just a single bud. They're a primary bud and a secondary bud. And if I had magnified that more, we probably could have found 3 or 4 other buds in there. And on the right-hand side, we see what a freeze-damaged bud looks like. So if you actually cut it open and see it, you can see the black tissue in there. That's dead tissue, so that bud will never develop. But what's interesting with grapes and with many perennials is that these compound buds have successive buds that have higher cold tolerance as the buds get smaller. And so the primary bud in Chardonnay grape might be only good to minus 23, but the secondary is good to minus 25. And the tertiary may be down to minus 25.5. But of course, the problem is those successive buds aren't as fruitful. So you'll often end up with a situation where we end up with a freeze event. We lost all the primary buds. We lost all the productivity. And all we're going to get is some buds with a few leaves on them and no fruit, because those subsequent buds were hardy, but they're not fruitful. And this is a problem that we see. And I do see this in other ornamentals. From time to time, we get leaves and no flowers. And I think this is a similar phenomenon that's going on there. So I struggled to bring in at least one ornamental, so I could bring this home to this group. And I know this because this happened on my property. So in that year, 2023, I have a century home. My house was built in 1895, and I have reason to believe that the forsythia on my property is almost that old as well. And in that year, the forsythia, come April, was green. There was no flowers whatsoever. And of course, this was a common occurrence in the valley, but because forsythia is complicated, and there's probably 13 different parents and crosses that have gone into that. You could drive down the road and see forsythia in beautiful bloom because of the crosses, and you could see situations like mine where there was no bloom whatsoever. Now, I know that forsythia can be hardier to minus 20 to minus 25, but can it get that way in a warm winter, when there's a preceding warm winter like we had? So I think that the forsythia, and this is very subjective, this is based solely on observation, behaves more like the Marquette grape than the Chardonnay grape. During periods of warm winter, it deacclimates. It's no longer hardy to minus 26 or 27. It's now only hardy to minus 24, 25, or maybe minus 20. And so then if a cold event immediately follows that, then there's a considerable amount of damage. So I've kind of loosely called it a Marquette or a Chardonnay strategy. If you looked at the Chardonnay from before, it kind of held constant through the winter. It wasn't worried about the warm temperatures. That didn't move its hardiness at all. But Marquette is very, as we would call it, twitchy. And one of the reasons I think that Marquette and Forsythia are similar is they're also their strategy is to break early in the spring. They break very early in the spring. They're some of the earliest, certainly in grape row, Marquette breaks probably before anything else. And Forsythia is similar. And so plants like that, as a strategy, will take the risk of losing that acclimation early on so that they can take advantage of a longer season if it's available to them. You have to pause for a minute and remember why I put this graph in. So yes, our winter minimum temperatures in Kentville. So again, because we talk about single freeze events, that's all we need to do damage to buds. So if we take the whole winter, that period from November to March, and find out what the lowest temperature was, that's what I've plotted here. So the lowest temperature observed in each of those years from 1913, I think this goes up to up to 2023. 2024. And so if we look at that over time, a couple things become apparent. You know, in the years that I show inside that rectangle, frequent episodes of minus 25. So this definitely would have dictated what we would have been able to grow in Nova Scotia, what we could have that could overwinter in terms of perennial crops. And although I guess there's always a silver lining to everything, even anthropogenic climate change. And so we can see from about 1970 on, when we start to see these winter minimum temperature shift, that is the emergence of the Nova Scotia wine grape industry, because it wasn't until that time we could actually get grapes reliably through the winter. So I'm going to pause here for a minute, because I've given a lot of information. And it'd be better if I could have this as more of a conversation and leave some room for questions before I move on to the next section.
Any questions here or
questions, comments, points of discussion, observations?
Any questions online? Anything coming in? Comments? No. Question.
No, it definitely was a bit of a washout, but I know I could drive around town and see some Forsythia plants would have all been exposed to the same temperature. They did much better than others. And some of those were probably just different crosses. I think I have probably one of the older original crosses.
Do you want me to read it out? Where's the chat here?
I have a question if you want to have it while you're looking for the chat.
Yeah, we saw this with rhododendron. That was to Jamie, that he says we saw this with the rhododendron. So I assume that's. Is there someone else's question?
Yes, I have one, please.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's fascinating the gradual changes in hardiness that you see, and you attribute it to a supercooling phenomenon, that if once you get to that one temperature, everything just goes really quickly. So in animals, supercooling is brought on or made possible by accumulation of certain cryoprotectants like glycerol and polyols and various substances, and also the absence of nucleators that sort of shield the organism from ice that could come in from the environment. So are similar strategies used in these plants, in these buds? Are they somehow limiting all free water in the cells so that it can't turn into anything until the capacity of that system, the supercooling elements, is overcome?
So you ask an excellent question, and you could have just hijacked the whole night. I could spend the rest of the night talking about that. I did my undergrad. I did my undergrad thesis work on freeze-tolerant frogs.
So it's good.
So in the animal world, so I talk about plants being able, buds of certain plants being able to supercool, so they freeze all in one event. We see a similar thing in the animal world with certain animals. So I did my undergrad work on my thesis on freeze-tolerant frogs. We have 2 species of frog in Nova Scotia that can also supercool. So they'll allow themselves to go down to a certain temperature and freeze. And so the question was about the way that these animals do this. They get rid of the nucleators that are in the body, things that could cause ice crystals to form. They add certain cryoprotectants to each cell so that the cells don't form, so that we can take essentially a sack of salty water, which is what a frog is, and we can get that freezing point much lower.
The frog
the question is,
differ. It is not a sack of salty water.
Sorry, I just talking purely in the grossest of physiological terms. But so the question is, do plants do the same thing? And so, well, let me give you the 2-minute answer. So there's about 10% of the money spent on studying these relationships in plants as we spend in animals. So there's many secrets here that we don't know. But we do know, and some of this is going on in our lab, and some of this I wasn't ready to present. So sugars are the biggest part of the antifreeze that we see inside of the individual cells inside of tissues in grape. And not only do we see it, but we think of a plant in the winter as being dormant. There's nothing going on. That it reached some state in November and it stayed there until April. But that's not the case at all. We actually see movements of sugars back and forth between the cane wood and the buds through the winter. Convergence from starch. So actually some energetic processes taking place. So somewhere in the concentration of sugars and the energetic processes that are taking place, breaking down starches and adding more sugar seems to be the primary way that all grape buds get to maybe -23, -24, -25. Beyond that, they do it by desiccation. So they're actually able to control the amount of water leaving the cells, which is further concentrates. So Marquette can take that -25 degrees of hardiness, and it can make that -35 just by controlling the amount of water that leaves the individual cells. So does that answer your question?
It's wonderful. It does sound a lot like frogs. Is the vacuole,
It does.
Is there a vacuole that is somehow involved as well? Is there?
No.
No?
We don't know yet. Don't know yet.
Oh,
We haven't studied at the microscopy level yet.
One of my very first interactions with freezing in plants was when somebody wanted me to analyze, to translate from German into English, how the vacuole behaved inside pine needles that were dissected in the cold in the Alps by some Swiss or some German researcher. And they described all these crystal formations within the vacuole. It was just amazing. Anyway, I'm enjoying this topic a lot. Thank you so much. Your answer was lovely, and I'm sure there'll be more to come.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great question. Okay, so let's now talk about the growing season, the May to October, and where we see the impact there.
This has to be the feeblest pickup attempt that I have ever encountered. You know, I expected it from the rest of the suburban.
I'm no longer able to advance my slides. Call Jim in to fix things.
Yeah. I get very little time to get to the gym for it. My guns at the office.
There's someone online. Could you mute online?
Look, my plan was to ask you, why are you about town as one professional helping another professional? Because I know what it's like.
Can you mute that, Rebecca? Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. But now I have.
Yeah.
The next is not wrong way. No, I think that's good. Where we need to be. So we look at growing season average temperature, just an excellent proxy for the amount of heat that would be available for developing plants. And we see, of course, that's on a very nice long-term trend since 1960. Again, measured in Kentville. And when we talk about the growing season, there's of course, frost is one of the biggest issues for all plants. especially wine grape can be especially susceptible. You see the picture on the right would be a grape bud that would have, might be, I don't know, 7 or 8 days since it broke. So that stage, those plants are incredibly vulnerable to cold temperatures. You would not have to be much below 0 to completely destroy that developing cane. So this analysis that I did here, maybe not have presented it in the most intuitive way. So let me just annotate this graph. So essentially what we've seen since 1913 is a shift in the last spring frost. There was a time when that happened at about Julian day, about 150, 140. So we would be very much late in May. And now we see that about May 7th. So that's a difference of about 3 weeks in the trend line that we've seen since 1913. But to me, when I look at this plot, what stands out is that look at how far those points are separated from the trend line. So there's huge variation in any given year. So there's, yes, the trend is shifted by 3 weeks, but there's plus or minus 2 weeks variation at any given time. So our last frost could come May 7th, or it could come 2 weeks later, or come 2 weeks earlier. And there's incredible variability that we can't model because it comes down to the dynamics of that individual spring. And does people remember 2018? Yes, June. Yes. Of course, this group would definitely remember 2018. And so in terms of being able to mitigate frost damage in the spring, we have frost fans. Now, they haven't been well adopted in Nova Scotia, but if you go to any other wine grape growing region in Canada, you'll see tons of these things, big permanent ones. This is the one that's in the vineyard that I manage. It's portable. We can actually move it around. And they're effective. I can get, for spring frost, I can probably get a degree and a half of warming on a frosty night and alleviate damage to buds. That's not a lot of protection. That probably would not have been sufficient on June 4th, 2018. For one thing, it was a different type of an event. There was actually wind that came with that cold event, so frost fans aren't going to be effective there. But for most events that we get in the spring, we have some ability to mitigate that damage. So June 7th, 2018, yes, we're all very, very sad. Certainly in the grape world, we were very sad. That's a Marquette shoot. Remember I said Marquette's very advanced. Those buds break early. That was probably an 18-inch shoot at the time of the June 4th freeze. There's primaries and secondaries that all emerged at the same time, all died, all gone. Chardonnay, on the other hand, which breaks much later and is much slower growth, did a little bit better in that year. So the notion of hardiness on its own isn't enough to tell you whether or not how well a plant's going to do in extreme weather. There are still other pitfalls, and a late frost is definitely one. So what we can say about the last spring frost, we can also say about the first fall frost. Again, we've seen about 3 weeks of change in the timing of that first fall frost. In fact, as we measure in Kentville this year, we've yet to actually reach that date. We've yet to actually have a observed temperature 0 degrees or below. So this is an interesting, again, we talk about the economics of growing grapes and the stresses and challenges of growing grapes. So this is a typical plot that I've shared with grape growers in Nova Scotia, and it shows the period where bud burst happened, which was, I think, in this year, 3rd week of May to early June, and then flowering starts, and then we have that period of veraison where the fruit is starting to ripen, we're starting to convert the starches into sugars, and we get the acid reduction. But if you look at that little arrow that says berry ripening, and we see there's this little spot on the end that says flavor compounds. Flavor compounds increase right at the very end. And that is what makes a grape grown in a different region has certain characteristics of that region. Nova Scotia wines are known for that crispness, that high acid, because the acids only start to go down late in the season. And so we don't get through all the acid reduction that they would get through in Southern Ontario or in BC because it cools off here faster. Our flavor compounds, we have different ones that emerge because it happens late and we don't get through that full the full stage of flavor development that they would have in warmer regions. And that gives us our characteristic flavors. So far, none of this is really a problem, but it does put our wines, I guess, on the edge of cool climate wines. So precipitation. Precipitation is on everybody's mind. When I started in 1998, I got hired because we were in the middle of a drought and we needed to know things about, at that point, they hired me to do insect work. We were having problems with controlling insect pests in apple orchards. And of course, we find ourselves right back to this point again this year. But anyway, if I look at our growing season precipitation, then this is just the total growing season precipitation. So it would be April through to the end of October. We've gained about 200 millimeters additional precipitation since 1914. You would not have known that this year, but that's where the trend has been heading. So each one of these bars represents a month, and this is the 25-year mean monthly precipitation for Kentville. And if you look at it in aggregate, if you add it all up, we end up in Kentville, Nova Scotia, with about 1.2, about this much rain that we would get every year if you added it all up, 1.2 meters. But on a monthly basis, we end up with a variance of about 44 millimeters. So we can't really point to a wet month or a dry month. We get, we are definitely in a wet region, agriculturally speaking. In fact, one of the biggest challenges in Nova Scotia, all perennial cropping systems, is to control the disease that comes as a result of excessive precipitation. I'm sure you see that in the ornamental world as well. So this was just this year in my vineyard. We had to make some extension. We had to add to our drainage system because we spend all of our money not on setting up irrigation for dry years. We spend it on getting rid of excess moisture in the soil. That's our reality. And certainly my system, my tile drainage system, runs all 12 months of the year. So there's always excessive moisture in the soil. So this is the same plot I showed before. This is the same monthly means, but what I've done is I've overlaid 2025 data. So those black triangles are the actual amounts of precipitation that we observed in 2025. And you can see we started out okay, about average, a few months a little bit above, a few months a little bit below. But this is where we get into trouble. These are the 4 months. And so our deficits ran probably for Kentville as low as 32% of the precipitation that we should have seen in that same period of time. And of course, it was manageable for a while. I planted grapes on June 15th. Couldn't believe how good the soil was, how beautiful it was. We were going to have such a great year. I think it had rained a few days before that. We never saw rain again until sometime in July. So very much, we spent all summer irrigating these plants just to keep them alive, not to get them to grow, not to get them to push, just to keep them alive. And so at some point this became desperate. And of course, then we saw it had the Long Lake wildfire and the Lake George wildfire late in that period in August and September. But I guess the good news, and not so helpful horticulturally or agriculturally, but that October has come back to more or less average values. And I'm pretty sure the conditions that set us up for a dry summer have all gone, and we should be back to more or less normal precipitation values. Can't make up what we lost. We can't make up in terms of biomass. That's lost, but we can at least refill watersheds and lakes and streams and things like that. I'll move through this quite quickly because I think we're probably running a little short on time here. These are just the total precipitation for the months June, July, August, and September for various places in Nova Scotia. And as you can see in the valley, more so than in Halifax, we were desperately low on precipitation. Every single one of these places should have seen between 350 to 400 millimeters. And so that's what we actually accumulated in that period of time. Very, very far behind where we should have been. And so that put us on the drought map. And it's not the first time we've been on the drought map as an area with significant drought, but we've actually scored in some of the highest levels of drought. So I think a D4, which is so the Annapolis Valley, Digby County, Annapolis County, and parts of the Amber Shore there, those are considered 1 in 50-year events. So this was definitely an extreme event. And that's updated as of September. I could not get the October drought map by the time I made this presentation. Extreme precipitation events. So I made up this plot in 2023 because we, of course, 2023 had incredibly extreme precipitation. And I just wanted to take a look at it. So I thought that it would probably be appropriate to measure, go back to 1913 and every rain event that was over 50 millimeters to see when that occurred. So as it turns out, from 1913 to 2023, there was 127 events in that 112 years. And so if these were evenly spaced through time, if there was no change, then I would expect that they would kind of form a straight line, but that's not what happened at all. They formed this curved line. And if you actually do some measurements on that, so 42% of these 50 millimeter events have happened just in the last 28 years, or in about 25% of the time. So we are seeing an acceleration of heavier rain events. And it doesn't matter what value I put in there, if I use 50 millimeters or 75 millimeters or 100 millimeters, we see this acceleration increasing. So we are definitely starting to see more extreme precipitation. And that definitely has some impacts. When you receive precipitation, I remember one year, I think it was 2023, we received 250 millimeters in about 8 days. So that's not horticulturally available precipitation that runs off, that damages roads, that ends up, we do store it in lakes and in basins, but a lot of that's not horticulturally available. So it's not as useful to us in agriculture. Although it does refill our irrigation ponds, which in Nova Scotia are almost all refilled by surface water. We don't mine, deep mine aquifers in Nova Scotia very much. We rely on surface water because we get 1.2 meters of rain a year. So I'm going to go through this. I presented this 2 years ago. This is probably the next couple of slides are the ones that probably mean the most to me. It's a message as I move to the end of my career that I want people to see. I want people to know where we are on this climate change journey. So in order to do that, I got to give you a couple of definitions here. SSPs, shared socioeconomic pathways. So when you think about it, when we try to figure out where we're going with climate change, are we going to exceed 2 degrees? Are we going to exceed 1.5 degrees? It comes down to essentially how the other 8 billion people on the planet are all going to behave. And so when we're trying to decide where we're headed, we use these SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways, to take into consideration social and economic, population growth, political direction, the amount of industry in your country, to see how much fossil fuel we're going to burn, how much CO2 we're going to put into the atmosphere. So the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses those scenarios to estimate the human impacts on climate change. And again, I based this off the report from 2021. There is another one available, although the same amount of modeling isn't available for it, so I didn't use it here. And the good news is Environment and Climate Change Canada has taken some of these scenarios, these different SSPs, and projected the impact on these very small areas, 10 kilometer by 6 kilometer areas. So we can take the province and we can look at, under different scenarios, how we're going to fare in terms of temperature, rain. And I know these things are modeled, they're not 100% accurate, but they're our best estimates that we have at this point. So let's break this table down line by line. So current year, the current would be the column of numbers on the left-hand side. I use 2024 data because that was the last year I had a full year's data. And then I have 2 other groups of columns. I'll actually walk over here and point to them. So this is 3 columns right here, SSP2, and these ones over here, SSP5. And the difference between those are SSP2 is what people thought, if we were to be able to make the technological changes and have less fossil fuel use, where we would end up in terms of CO2 emissions. It was the road that we hoped that we were all on. SSP5 is the one where we don't have very much control of this at all. It escapes us, and we end up with sharply increasing CO2 levels. Well, what I want to put out here, what I want to show you here, and we're going to do this line by line. So we look at the mean temperature in 2024, it was 8.9 degrees. We didn't predict that that was going to happen until, well, maybe 2045 under the gentler scenario, and maybe 2035 under the most aggressive scenario. We're already there. In terms of the hottest day, Kentville, 32.9 degrees. That's the same thing. We're looking at what they predicted where we would be in 2040. Or if under SSP5, we would have been there, well, somewhere in the 2040s. Days over 25, same thing. We end up somewhere around 2040, 2045, 2050. Days below -15, days below -25. Again, we're well ahead of where we should be looking at 2024 data. I ran this analysis using 2023 data. It ends up telling the same story. We have gotten farther down the road in realizing the impacts of climate change than where we thought we would be. Same trend for days below zero. And although I find this one curious, given where we are this year, we haven't gotten close to where they expected we would be in terms of the amount of precipitation, because they do anticipate that that will go up. We added 200 millimeters roughly from 1913 to 2023, and they suggest that we'll add another 200 to 300 between then and now, and we are still lagging behind on that. So to me, the point I want to distill from this is that we talk about what the future is going to look like, and we are now living in some of that future. We see that in terms of the way crops are behaving, and we see that in terms of the things that we're now starting to be able to grow in our growing region. And so I guess I'll kind of end on this one. So this was a projection that I did looking at the European standards for how much heat we needed to grow different varieties of grapes. So I presented this to grape growers. So Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So if you look at the little black triangle on the left-hand side in 2025, so that's kind of where we were on that year. We were a little bit below the European standard for the amount of heat we needed to grow Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not growing it here, but we're not growing it to the same level of maturity. And so under an SSP2 scenario, we would have, it wouldn't have been very long before we would have been well into that European, into that standard for European maturity of those varieties. We do grow Gamay here as well. It requires even more heat. But again, we struggle in a lot of years to get enough ripeness to make really well-balanced wines. And did you ever think that anyone would talk about growing Merlot in Nova Scotia? Like, do you know anything about Merlot? Yeah, it likes heat. It needs a lot of heat. And it needs better, warmer winters than we have too. So we're a long ways. Under the SSP2 scenario, we're a long ways from ever having Merlot in Nova Scotia. But if we look at the SSP5 scenario, the worst scenario, we're well within the range of the European standard for Chardonnay Pinot Noir. By 2040, we're growing Gamay quite comfortably and ripening it the same as they would in Europe. And we even make it to that level for Merlot. Now, when I showed this to the grape growers, I had to add the caveat. I'm not saying anybody should go out and buy some Merlot vines and pop them in the ground. That's not what I'm saying. To me, it's an illustration from having worked in the industry and knowing what we can grow here and knowing what we can mature, that we could even consider in 25 years to 30 years that we would be on the edge of being able to ripen a Merlot grape in Nova Scotia. That's a sobering point that I think we all need to consider. That's all I have. Questions?
Wonderful. So thanks so much. So Questions? First, we'll hear, and I can bring the microphone down so that we can hear. So is there anyone for questions? Yes.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is with respect to the increase in variation in mean and low and high temperatures, and also that last graph that you had on about the acceleration in high water events. So is that, are those extreme trends accelerated by the overall increase in mean temperatures?
In all, I'm thinking of a range of indicators.
So I like to show these analyses separately, because as we can see, for instance, 2025, if you look at 2023, we had very warm temperatures. It was a El Nino year, so that added to the existing forcing that we would have seen by anthropogenic climate change. And it was a very wet year. In 2025, the year that we're in now, we see most of that temperature effect is still there, but almost no rain, because in meteorological terms, there's many variables, there's many things going on in the background here. And also happened this year, and this is another prediction of climate change, is that the high pressure systems that give us our beautiful summers in Nova Scotia, the Bermuda High and the Northern Canadian High, got incredibly large and stationary. And that's why we didn't get the rain that we would normally have in that season. They were stationary for 4 months, almost unheard of. But that is also a prediction of climate change in the future, that these high pressure zones will get larger. They will likely block more precipitation. So it causes me to doubt the long-term predictions for precipitation that I even presented to you. Now, I'm not neither a climatologist nor a meteorologist. I present other people's work, and I do so and I reference it. But I'm beginning to question how accurately they can say that we're going to have 1,400 millimeters of rain per year in 2050 if we don't understand completely how these high pressure zones are going to behave. And this year, look, if you were to go out now, and I've searched for months to find academic papers on why those high pressure zones behave the way they did, nothing. Pin drop moment, because they don't know. We don't know yet. We're always on the edge of this, trying to catch up. It took us to 2025 to realize why 2023 was so warm, and so we're into a new area of climatology, meteorology, and so there's usually not a lot of immediate answers to questions like the one that you have. I do see the extreme events driving in, and even in this year, we've had events over 50 millimeters. They're becoming far more frequent. It used to be we wouldn't see one a year. Now we definitely see one a year, if not 2 or 3 a year. And so that will drive, I think, precipitation in the future. But you still have to consider that we can have blocking highs that can move our precipitation for the summer. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. Any other questions here? Maybe I can go to online. Any questions online? Just put them in the chat. Oh, Helga. Can you unmute Helga? Okay,
Yes,
go
I
ahead.
can. Yes, that was an excellent presentation. Very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I was intrigued when you mentioned that all of the irrigation in Nova Scotia is done from surface waters. And do you hear or people reconsidering that in terms of the variability and the amount of rain that's coming? And if they are, is there enough knowledge about aquifers to be able to do anything effective that would use subterranean sources of water?
People hear that in the audience? She's asking about aquifers, whether there's any discussion of using aquifers in Nova Scotia.
So I'll comment that I didn't put in the presentation, but that I think is interesting that we should consider. So yes, we in Nova Scotia typically get 1.2 meters of precipitation a year. But we could certainly survive on much less than that. We could survive on probably, you know, if I look at the Niagara region, they're probably around 1,000, about a meter of precipitation. If I go to Kelowna, BC, they're 500 to 600. Because they anticipate this and they've been able to put the technology in place to get water from the aquifers to feed the systems as they need them. So we have excessive moisture, and it's very hard to say, given our composite of crops that we grow, exactly what would be the point where we would be completely stressed and unable to meet those needs. When I came in 98 on the heels of that drought, which wasn't nearly as bad as it was this year, we were talking about mining the deep aquifers and making more reliable, because that dry period lasted about 3 years. So there was considerable talk about putting the infrastructure in place to get at that water that's deep down. But of course, these are huge investments, and the problem went away before the drills started turning. And you know, agriculture is an optimized business. If we don't think we need it, if in 7 out of 10 years we don't need it, then we're probably not going to put that investment in. Whether this year, I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement until we see this come again next year, maybe the year after that. Then you're going to see people getting very serious about calling in the drilling.